Science is awesome and I love it so. There's still lots and lots of things science don't know. There have been major discoveries throughout history, but this universe of ours is still one great big mystery. It'll be perfect and beautiful, it'll be testable and provable, and that's what I like. So science is awesome and I love it so. There's still lots and lots of things science don't know. There have been major discoveries throughout history, but this universe of ours is still one great big mystery.
Hey!
How to write a PreLab.
Your objectives. You should be able to format a PreLab, which is very important because you'll be doing it a lot this year.
And you should be able to use your IPS textbook to create a usable PreLab.
So IPS stands for Introduction to Physical Science. So this is the textbook that we use to, that a lot of the experiments that we do in 8th grade are based off of.
The textbook itself is not always that helpful when you're doing a lab. All of the labs are described in a lot of detail and there's great pictures and great instructions, but when you're actually doing the lab, it's a lot more helpful to have step-by-step instructions.
So that's why you're going to create a PreLab, and we're going to show you how.
The general outline for your PreLab, you're going to want to have a title, a purpose, a hypothesis, a procedure, which will include a drawing and blue dot questions, and then you're going to want to set up the data tables before you do the lab.
So all this will, if you do this planning beforehand, it will ensure that you can follow the instructions and collect the data that you need when you're in the lab instead of trying to scramble to figure out what you're doing and where you're going to write your data and stuff like that.
So we're going to show you how we want your lab set up. So here's the basics. You're going to have your name in the upper right hand corner, followed by the date. And then on the left, you're going to have the experiment title. Make sure you put experiment 1.1 or the number to the experiment. So experiment 1.4 or 1.11, so that's important. And then also the title of the experiment. So here we're doing experiment 1.1, the heating of baking soda.
So when you're watching this video at home, you should probably have your IPS book open to experiment 1.1 so you can follow along.
So the first thing is that you want to write the purpose. So you'll be able to find the purpose kind of in two different places. You'll be able to hear it in the video where we explain the purpose. You'll also be able to see it somewhere in the textbook. And this is one of those things that is sometimes buried in the text of the textbook. But you can find it in each one of the experiments. It does explain the purpose.
In this case, our purpose is to see what happens when baking soda is heated in a test tube. Is this how all of the purposes are going to be formatted?
Not always. Sometimes it's a statement.
Sometimes it's a question.
Sometimes it's a question. Sometimes it's really hard to understand what the question is. And sometimes your purpose will actually have two purposes. So you'll have a purpose for day 1 and day 2, where there's two parts to the experiment with two different purposes.
So it sounds like the purpose can sometimes be a tough thing to do, so make sure that you are watching the video very carefully. Next up is the hypothesis, so what you think is going to happen. In all cases, please make sure that you're formatting your hypothesis in the if, then, and because format.
So you won't always have to do a hypothesis for each experiment, because just some experiments that we do in 8th grade don't lend themselves to hypothesis. So your teacher will let you know whether you need to do a hypothesis for that particular experiment or not.
In this case, you can have a hypothesis, and so we thought if I heat baking soda in a test tube, then nothing will happen because heating something won't change it. Please remember that your hypothesis might very well be different than all of the other people in the class, and that's fine as long as you came up with the hypothesis yourself.
So next is the procedure. This is probably the most important part of your PreLab. You want to make sure you write a detailed procedure, so you use your notebook or your PreLab to do the experiment.
So the procedure is something that we want you to spend a lot of time with, that we want you to be able to write down detailed information. And the goal for you writing down the procedure is that when you come into the lab that day, when you come to the science classroom that day and we're going to do that experiment, we want you to be able to do the experiment independently. That's why we spent so much time, making the videos and explaining the directions, so that when you come in, you know what you're doing. That allows us as your teachers to be able to help you figure out what's actually going on and answer kind of some tougher questions rather than always answering the question, what am I supposed to do next? So this are written instructions for you to know exactly what you're doing when you come in.
This is going to take a little interpretation because all of the procedures in your IPS book in paragraph form, you want to turn it into step by step. So if you are on experiment 1.1, we can turn that first chunk of information into a step. Put baking soda into a dry test tube to 0.5 centimeters height. I would like you to notice a few things. This is a short sentence that tells me exactly what to do, and I have underlined baking soda and test tube. Why did I do that?
Well, because you want to make sure you know what materials you're going to be using for each step. So you want to highlight them or underline. You want to highlight them or underline them in each one of your lines.
It also helps you when you're initially setting up the experiment. You can kind of just glance through your procedure and get an idea of what type of materials that you're going to need for the actual experiment, so you can gather those before you actually start the experiment itself.
This is going to be a very common procedural step in your IPS labs, which will be set up the apparatus.
It doesn't tell you exactly how to set it up, and that's okay, but you want to make sure that you include a drawing so you remember how to set up the actual apparatus that you're using in your experiment.
And it's important to label your drawing so that you know exactly what you're supposed to have in your setup. So we don't expect you to be perfect artists all the time, but if you use labels for your drawing, then you know what is actually going into the experimental setup.
In our apparatus, we need a Bunsen burner. There is an angled test tube that has some baking soda in it. Inserted into the test tube is a rubber stopper with glass tubing, angled glass tubing. There's a hose connected to the angled glass tubing. And then we have a big tub of water here. And then in the tub of water is an upside down bottle. And the tube goes into the bottle up to the top, and that is full of water. Is there anything else? I need to label it.
Burner stand.
All right. Over the Bunsen burner is a burner stand. And this is great, but as you can see, I am not the greatest artist. You don't have to be, but that's why you need to label your diagram.
Like one thing that's probably hard to see in that diagram, but would be important to label, is that your water bottle that you're collecting in, the upside down water bottle, is filled with water. So that's something that would probably be easy to forget, but if you didn't fill that water bottle with water when you did this experiment, you would have to start the experiment over again.
And another thing that you should probably remember is that your test tube is not just floating in the middle of the air. It's actually attached to your pegboard with clamps. So don't forget to include the clamps, Ms. Berna.
Thanks for the reminder, Mr. Pappas. Once you have your diagram, we're just going to move on to the next step, which is to get your setup checked by the teacher and then begin heating baking soda and observe.
So as you can see, even though this procedure is only 3 steps, it really can, it allows us to do the experiment independently. And that's because we have a good drawing and a good accurate drawing with a labeled diagram. And a ball.
Ball?
So notice I left a little bit of space for observations. Leave as much as you need. And then next, in the procedure, we have a blue dot question, which is a question in blue with a dot next to it. And you need to write those questions into your pre-lab. This one is, what do you observe at the bottom of the test tube and near the top? And then it's also a good idea to highlight your blue dot questions, so if you need to refer back to them later, you can easily find them.
These blue dot questions are only found in the textbook. They are not found in the videos themselves. So this is why when you're doing a pre-lab in anticipation of doing an experiment, you're going to need to watch the video and use the textbook at the same time.
And a lot of times these blue dot questions will actually be part of your procedure and lead you through the lab.
The next thing you're going to need to set up is your data table. There is not one general way to set up a data table for all experiments. You're just going to need to think about what kind of information and data you're going to need to record and what the best way to arrange it is.
Yep.
We're not going to tell you how to do it.
But we'll help.
Maybe. So to sum it all up, again, you should be able to know how to do a pre-lab. You're going to be doing them a lot, so after the first couple, they'll come very easy to you. So don't forget, first thing, put your name in the upper right-hand corner with the date, and then the title in the left corner.
Make sure that you include the purpose, which you can find in both the textbook and the pre-lab videos.
If the lab lends itself to a hypothesis, please make sure you have a hypothesis in the if, then, and maybe because format.
We put in materials with the question mark. No, don't forget about your materials. Those should be in your procedure. Underline them, highlight them. I'm sorry.
And labeled in your diagram as well.
Yeah.
Then in the body of your procedure, you need to make sure you include that diagram, which is labeled with materials, and include the blue dot questions, which should be highlighted.
The last thing is that you want to have your data table organized ahead of time. So you want to make sure that you have the data listed that you want to collect and a place to actually organize it in your notebook.
Please remember that all of this needs to be completed before you come to class to do the lab. It's a pre-lab. It's all the preparatory work that needs to be done before the lab.